like a house like that. And it wasn't people who were particularly convinced about the the importance of modern art and modern design. It made somehow common sense to them.
The enthusiasm of the 50s was in the clients as well as the designers. They were enthusiastic to do something new. They were enthusiastic to build. It was Huxley's Brave New World.
In comparison to New York, where the wealthy, the ambitious, commissioned modern houses so as to be admired, very different, simple people commissioned me to design modern houses here. I remember one of them was a sign writer. He was obviously very intrigued with the geometry and the design elements of what he saw that appealed to him, and one man was an employee of the water board, so it was very average citizens.
By the 1960s, wood design even made an impression on the mass market. Building firms like Pettit and Sevitt created a production line for architect-designed homes. 15 squares for $15,000.
We built 3,500 houses, but we very consciously said we're going to make a product, like a refrigerator or a motor car. You've got to sell it, you've got to demonstrate it, and you want to sell a lot of them.
One of Sydney's leading young architects, Ken Woolley, designed most of the Pettit and Sevitt houses. These were unique times. Land was available and relatively cheap. Modern architecture was demystified, and the clients queued up to buy.
They were invited to attend an interview with me. Sometimes the whole family would arrive, children and all. At times the foyer looked like a doctor's waiting room. We'd sit down around a table and they'd explain what they wanted, and they'd usually fallen in love with the house. The demonstration houses were very seductive in that sense. When we did the first real demonstration house, it was put to me as to what we will do with this interior. And I said, well, let's paint it white and just keep it nice and simple and clean, and people can project their idea of what they want to do with the inside. Presumably they'd say, oh, well, that'd be great, I'll put a yellow wall there and I'll put a brown wall here or whatever. The reality was that once they had seen it white, and it's got nothing to do with the merits of white, the fact that they'd seen this product in white, they couldn't imagine it any other way, because they'd experienced the whole experience of a work of architecture, even in a modest piece of architecture, but the whole work was there. They walked in the door, the space was around, it sounded and it felt and it smelt and it looked as a complete sensory experience.
Young architects were evangelists for the modern style, initiating their bewildered clients into the mysteries of contemporary architectural theory.
My very first job that I did at the age of 24 was with the Presbyterian Church up at Tokal. The enthusiasm was overwhelming. These poor people, I mean, were swamped with. It was just like a Labrador dog, I suppose, who were, wagging tails and couldn't be more effusive about ideas and ways that people should be educated in the country. And it went beyond architecture of saying students should, be part of the soil, and the buildings had to come out of the particular site, and the materials had to be local, and we had a great Australian tradition and culture, and that had to be exploited. And we were virtually flying in the face of modernism and the Bauhaus. And to start talking about the Bauhaus to the Presbyterian Church was they were winced with pain when you talked about things like that.
these theories and ideas from abroad began to merge with the Australian landscape and climate. And by the 1970s, one house in particular would change the way the rest of the world saw Australian architecture.
The builder had difficulty getting materials delivered. He would send somebody out, give the address, they'd bring the materials out and go back into the town not to deliver them. The builder would ring up and say, look, what's happened to the material? And they said, we went out last night to deliver the material and all we saw was a barn being built. One of my later clients came out here, and when he was about to engage me, I said, well, you better come and see this house to see what you think. And he got to the outside and I could see he was very disturbed by it. And I brought him inside and it was a great relief for him. And he said, you know, he said, you wouldn't buy it from the outside, would you? And I said, well, I suppose, you know, would you eat a pineapple from the outside? To have a perfect space, you require a perfect human. There's no such animal. But there are spaces that work beautifully. The Kempsey House was designed in 1974, and I believe it represents the first time I had the opportunity of finding a direction the idea of a building breathing so that you could open it up, feather off that amount of air coming in, shutting it down, opening up the light level, having another system on the outside of louvers that control the amount of light, that control the ventilation as well, and insect screen sandwich in between. In other words, the skin of the building is in many ways, like in landscape terms, an ecotone. It's the edge. It's the most exciting parts of any landscape. To look at the colour of it. The timber is going to weather to the grey of the landscape, the grey of the trees, the grey of the fence posts. So I started off using a grey stain so that when the stain wore away, it would start to then develop into the patina that develops with the weathering of timber. This to me is just wondrous to see the way the building takes on the landscape, how the landscape starts to consume it. It's something I have sought my whole career, is to find that quietness, a quietness of architecture, where you can go past the work and you think, oh, that was quite interesting, let's go back and look. And the more you look at it, the more interesting it becomes. And that's one of the things about architecture. It must be more than a one-liner. It must be like the onion, that you take one layer off and there's another layer, and yet another layer, and another layer. So it must be operating at many levels. It simply can't be texture on a facade.
There are a number of identifiable positions in Australian architecture, but there isn't a single theme that you could make in it, and I regard that as healthy. I mean, there is what people in Melbourne tend to sneer at, the touch the ground lightly bush hut approach of Glenn Murcutt and his followers, and that's very well known overseas. And if you were overseas, you'd usually get people thinking that that's what Australian architecture is all about. But in fact, it's one of the most urbanized countries in the world, and most of our architecture is suburban, it's not bush.
I've always been an unabashed fan of the suburbs. I've admired the wonderful sense of survival of suburban Australia, quite in spite of the tiresome harassment from architectural aesthetics. I see them as a source of fabulous energy.
Many architects have been patronising about the Australian suburbs, where most people in turn are more than happy to get by without an architect. But this is where most of us live or grew up. The suburbs hold powerful memories, and some architects began to acknowledge this. The result was a new kind of building, with energy, whimsy and humour. A reaction to the clean slate of modernism.
The forces that drove that building were, to an extent, the sense that the undergraduate population deserved to have a building that might reflect a certain wit and charm and some whimsy that they could call their own.
To take a risk in architecture, it helps to have a well-funded and daring patron. RMIT University is the incubator for new architecture in Melbourne. They aim to get one major building from every top architect in the city. This patronage creates a radical climate for architecture, where some of the certainties of modernism are being turned on their heads.
The modernist theme, I guess, that the original, its value, its main value is that it's original, that it's new, that it's the one-off, that so-and-so did it. Whereas really the great tradition of architecture is that the first one probably wasn't all that good, and the second one probably wasn't all that good either, but you know, by the time you got to the 50th Gothic cathedral, they were really doing some good work. So really the idea of the copy in architecture is much more pervasive than the original is, and yet avant-gardism, I suppose, or modernism, seems to have always focused on this, the one-off. We built up quite a technique almost around this idea of the copy. We actually literally used photocopies. We didn't just do straight photocopies. You know, we would move the photocopier about. We scanned those photocopies. We sort of pixelated those photocopies. We actually built the pixelations into buildings. Force them to sort of give up something secret of themselves through this sort of local process, through our kind of interrogation of them. And in doing so, we could make them really belong to us more than they did belong to somebody else. Our version of Robert Venturi's house, Cromwell Clinic, because it was a little medical clinic in Footscray, the client loved it. They loved that idea of a building having a story. We found that as we put this on the photocopier and stretched it, that sort of slot in the building became really quite a cavernous sort of space. We blew the image up quite big. We took the idea that if we made each pixel into a brick, we could build it as a brick veneer version. So our theme of saying Australia is in fact a kind of absorbing, knowing kind of culture, and that we can take things from elsewhere, translate them into our own tongue, if you like, and produce the local version.
In the 1960s, our local version of modernism was the high-rise housing block. Not one of architecture's greatest triumphs. But 40 years later, architects are still trying to get it right. One of the 60s blocks has recently had a facelift.
When it gets down to providing housing for people in the Housing Commission, I think to give them a bit of style is actually one of the best things you could give them. I think probably the rich don't really need style. Our idea was that there's really nothing wrong with high-rise housing. High-rise housing is an excellent form of housing, but that those buildings needed some of those qualities of the fashionable apartment, the hotel, the resort. You know, maybe you have a gym or a swimming pool or something like that on the roof. The reality was that we weren't building a swimming pool or a gym up there. We were in fact extending the motor room up there for the extra lifts and electrical equipment. But we housed them in Oscar Niemeyer's chapel in South America, which is not unlike in shape the McDonald's sign. Over time, somehow some products or some buildings, in the case of architecture, seem to be able to keep up. They seem to constantly keep responding to that society. People seem to be able to keep reinterpreting them and sort of making them new, if you like. But it's this special quality that some things have, and it's quite often the case that things appear ugly. That is, that we're unused to them, or they're a bit different to our expectations or something like that at a particular time. Just a few years later, they may well be, seen as beautiful. In other words, our eye is constantly shifting.
A new generation of Australian architects is now making its mark. The modernist dream of affordable architecture for the masses may seem as far away as ever. But there is still enough trusting and adventurous clients to keep the new visions alive.
I suspect that in some ways we are in quite a good position in that we're on the kind of crest of a wave of development and building, and also I think a sort of renewed interest in architecture as a kind of legitimate area of endeavour that really does add value to people's lives. I think that at the moment architects of our generation are getting quite a lot of work because of that, and that's offering us quite a lot of building opportunities that perhaps 5 years ago would have been much harder.
That's where we're at a huge advantage, because we get to build here. For an architect in their 30s, like me, to have a body of built work like I've got is a luxury that is not afforded to architects anywhere else in the world. So we're very fortunate to get to build our work. An architect in New York in their 30s would boast a folio of drawings and models. An architect in London in their 30s would boast a folio of drawings and models and maybe a kitchen and a bathroom.
There are architects in Melbourne particularly making work that has, I think, had a strong attraction to the rest of the world, both intellectually and formally.
In some ways I think now it's quite a good time to be a sort of early or a sort of younger practice, and I think we're also at an interesting time in that there are a number of key people who are happy to take a punt on younger practices with sort of more ideas driven than perhaps experience driven.
Architecture at its high point is representative of the culture and of our time. It reflects our time. Hopefully it says something about the future. It may also say something about the past. But ultimately it reflects the greatness or the failure of a culture.
Our clients were demanding for something that was abstract and didn't look like a happy face with a chimney.
Roger Wood and Randall Marsh have little affection for the idea of an Australian style. And all these clients wanted was an exciting and contemporary family house.
Their only brief was that the house had to be big, that the house had to not give anything away from the street, and beyond that they left it up to us.
There was another major part to the brief, and that was that their eldest son was going to be 13 shortly after the house opened, and that we should have a living space that was suitable for a bar mitzvah for at least 300 people, 2 punk bands and an idea about family. They had 450 people and a mosh pit in the middle of the living room, and to our great surprise there was still space left over. Suburban subdivision is something that we grew up in, and we've got a fondness too, but we always think it needs challenging. And when applying for a planning permit for this house, the council said that we had to address the context that we were building in. So I looked at the context and said to the planner that I thought it was somewhere between Tel Aviv and a James Bond film.
In some ways it's coincidental, it's located here. It could be in it could be in a paddock, for example. It could be in Australia, it could also be somewhere else in the world.
When the house was nearing completion, people felt that it was either unfinished or going to be a squash court. When the building was occupied by our clients, they woke up in the morning looking out the kitchen window when making coffee to see 5 people in black suits who were architects thinking that the house was unfinished and wanting to look at it.
So what's this house doing here? And what's it got to do with Australian architecture? If nothing else, it's in the suburbs and thumbing its concrete nose at convention.
The appeal of a sense of vernacular, I think, is out of some sentimentality and a reassurance in what is known. And it is beautiful to drive through the countryside and see a rusted tin shed. It's a romantic thing because it makes you think about its context, which is rural. It makes you think about its function, which was industrious. And I think they're terrific notions, but it doesn't necessarily simply transfer to a residential piece of architecture on a spectacular site, claiming to have captured a vernacular.
For a long time, it's been considered that the use of corrugated iron, for instance, and the use of, say, the pavilion in the bush is clearly some kind of architectural or great Australian architectural moment, and that's certainly what an international audience, I think, expects of Australian architecture, and you really have to work pretty hard to dissuade them of that idea.
There are lots of other Australian architectures, if you want to argue it that way, that are quite different because they're developed through different circumstances, different climates, different sites, different clients. I like to think that we can go quite easily and build buildings in other parts of the world which are equally as good and equally appropriate.
Impala แอฟริกันมีปฏิกิริยาเดียวกันต่อกลิ่นของอันตราย
James Bond film.
In some ways it's coincidental, it's located here. It could be in a paddock, for example. It could be in Australia, it could also be somewhere else in the world.
When the house was nearing completion, people felt that it was either unfinished or going to be a squash court. When the building was occupied by our clients, they woke up in the morning looking out the kitchen window when making coffee to see 5 people in black suits who were architects thinking that the house was unfinished and wanting to look at it.
So what's this house doing here? And what's it got to do with Australian architecture? If nothing else, it's in the suburbs and thumbing its concrete nose at convention.
The appeal of a sense of vernacular, I think, is out of some sentimentality and a reassurance in what is known. And it is beautiful to drive through the countryside and see a rusted tin shed. It's a romantic thing because it makes you think about its context, which is rural. It makes you think about its function, which was industrious. And I think they're terrific notions, but it doesn't necessarily simply transfer to a residential piece of architecture on a spectacular site, claiming to have captured a vernacular.
For a long time, it's been considered that the use of corrugated iron, for instance, and the use of, say, the pavilion in the bush is clearly some kind of architectural or great Australian architectural moment, and that's certainly what an international audience, I think, expects of Australian architecture, and you really have to work pretty hard to dissuade them of that idea.
There are lots of other Australian architectures, if you want to argue it that way, that are quite different because they're developed through different circumstances, different climates, different sites, different clients. I like to think that we can go quite easily and build buildings in other parts of the world which are equally as good and equally appropriate.
The coalface of modern Australian architecture is now more likely to be found in the renewal of inner suburbs. And the minimalism and machine-age principles of the early modernists are being revived.
If you look at the volume behind me, you'll see that it's essentially 2 terrace houses opened up entirely. And whilst we say yes, it would be fantastic for everybody to have this space, it's obviously not possible. It depends on the site that you have in the first place. A lot of the apartments that we're doing at the moment are long tubes with views, with basically windows at the front and the rear of the tube to gain the cross ventilation through. And it's still how you work those proportions of those spaces to make them feel spacious.
For Tina Engelin and Ian Moore, less is more. Everything superfluous is out, including the air conditioning. But what's sensible for the environment doesn't always make sense to the most powerful force in city architecture, the developer.
In the majority of the apartment buildings we're now working on, we've taken the principles that we've been applying for years in our houses and saying to the developers, you don't need to air condition any building in Australia if it's designed properly. And it also goes back to the first apartment building that I did 10 years ago in New Guinea, and that's obviously a building on the equator, very, very hot, but a beautiful climate really, and there's lovely sea breezes that come off the harbour. And in that building, I said to the client, you know, there's absolutely no requirement for us to air condition this building, and there's certainly no requirement to air condition buildings in Sydney. And in the New Guinea building, we proved that just by having a big wall facing the harbour that opened up and allowed the sea breeze to roll in, and the whole back of the apartments to be louvered so that you could draw that breeze through, there was no requirement for air conditioning. And there was a reluctance on the part of people to actually move into those apartments because they couldn't find the air conditioner on the wall. But once a couple of people actually moved in and said, well, it's fantastic, you know, we don't need air conditioning, and the breeze is great, and you feel more in touch with the outside environment. You're not locked in the sealed container.
Generally, the clients who are coming to us for houses are fairly like-minded and they don't need very much convincing. But when you're doing apartment developments, the end user has not approached you directly, and so there's a mindset that's been created through the sales market where air conditioning is like an optional extra that you need to have for resale value. So that's been a difficult one, and we're just basically saying client per client as the queries are coming to us, please try it first because you've never experienced it.
The developer has to be the one who's controlling all aspects of a project, mainly because it's the developer who has to be across
all areas, from council approvals through to finance to construction to the selling of the units. You do sometimes hit issues with architects who have a great vision for a site, and sometimes it's not practical, or the developer doesn't believe it's in the best interest of the market that we're trying to develop for, and that can lead to some conflict. But at the end of the day, it must be the developer who's calling the shots.
The difficulty is that developers actually listen to marketing agents, because marketing agents are the ones who can ensure them that the profit margins are there.
What we've done is shown them a completely different way of looking at the buildings. Got the marketing agents to redo the returns based on ours, and then they've also done the sort of construction costs, and they will find that the construction costs are higher than the original ones, but the return is considerably higher as well. So at the end of the day, spending a bit more to make a lot more.
I think good architecture stimulates people. It's an architecture that makes people react. It's an architecture that captivates people and engages people and makes contact with people. They may not like it, they may hate it, but at least it engages them and stimulates their thoughts about that particular building, and maybe buildings in the broader context, and the urban design in the broader context.
Architecture is about making art with someone else's money. And architects complain about the developers who take the art out of architecture by slashing the bottom line. Melbourne architects Nation Fender Katsalidis solved that problem by developing their own apartment tower and setting a new standard.
I think it's growing. I think the confidence of the Australian public is growing and growing, and public perception is becoming more sophisticated all the time. Now it's incumbent on any, for instance, residential project to be a very, very good piece of design work, and developers are looking for good architects to produce good buildings to help them with their sales. I think these days, if projects are in any way not up to scratch, there's a great chance they won't make it.
I think very much they know that England-Moore can be seen almost as a product, you know, and sometimes in order to convince certain people, we use the analogy of the sort of the fashion labels, and that there is there's Prada and there's Armani and Calvin Klein. You know, they're slightly different, but you don't go to Prada and expect to get Country Road.
I suppose the greatest compliment that anyone can pay us when they walk into our buildings is to notice the building, to actually stand back and look at the building.
And we like to think that people could move into our houses with some antique furniture, and it would sit as comfortably as the furniture that we would probably prefer to see in there. And you know, I think that
we just want to pick the antique furniture. That's the trouble.
I think working on this larger scale now with these apartments, and you're looking at some buildings up to 140 apartments, you know, you can't control the lives of 140 people.
We're learning to let go, and it's hard. We'd like to work as a personal stylist for each and every one of them, because we care that much, but at the end of the day, we just have to let go.
There are more than 9,000 architects working in Australia. Not all of them can work for the fabulously wealthy. But the principles and heritage of good design can still apply on a budget. The architect's daily challenge is to convince new clients of the value that fresh air, light and modernity can bring to everyday life in a well-designed world.
Well, my father was a concreter, and I used to enjoy going out on building sites with him and inspecting, sort of buildings under construction. And he built such things as the American Express Tower, the Regent Hotel in Sydney, Australia Square, and Harry Seidler's number 2 Glen Street. So rather than cooking with my mum at home, I used to rush out and look at building sites and so on. I think when I actually started architecture, it then totally crystallised that architects could make a real change to people's lives. One of the most satisfying things as an architect is people ring up and say, I really love living in this house, I really love the breezes, I really love the way the sun comes in, or I love the way you put cupboards there so I can put things away. I can take you on a drive up Victoria Road towards the suburbs where I could point out a number of buildings that are poorly built, poorly designed and sited incorrectly on the block. The windows are all facing south so that people get no sun, and they haven't taken advantage of the site. This is a typical suburban house that was built in the early part of the 20th century, and as such the rooms are fairly compact and cellular and having little integration from one room to another. Perfect for bedrooms but not so good for living these days. The house has got fantastic detailing and lovely ceilings and so on, but rather than mimic the original house, what we've tried to do is form a transition zone between the old house and the character of the old house to the new pavilion, which is through this lowered ceiling. And then by creating a spatial element here with the ceiling rather than having it as a sort of minimalist box, it's meant to have a higher ceiling and also integrate the indoors with the outdoors, and using devices such as the bifold doors and also devices such as louver windows to create a better transition between the garden and the house, and again using external sun shading which keeps the heat off the glass. So it's all those things that Australians want in their lifestyle now. Care, ease of utilising the space, light, ventilation, and that great Australian situation of having the indoors and the outdoors integrated. And then using sort of fairly inexpensive materials and keeping this as a lightweight pavilion with a corrugated iron roof and so on. And that certainly keeps the cost down and creates such a beautiful space for modern living in this century. Architects need to take responsibility for what they do across all levels, and they have to be proud of everything that they do when they drive past it. I think we have got to get ourselves out of the mindset that the architect was forced into it by the developer, or the architect had to make that approach or make excuses for their work. We must come of age to say we will guide the developers and we will guide those people who put their money up to give them a really good solution to the problems or to what they're trying to create.
So how do you ever define good architecture? There are countless solutions to every problem. Yet sometimes, almost against the odds, something remarkable will rise from the soil. Perfect space from a simple idea. So simple and appropriate that we wonder why we can't get it right every time. But not even a lifetime of experience leads to certainty.
I'm totally vulnerable. I have the confidence to know that if I work at it hard enough, I'll get a good solution. I know when the thing is still bad. It's very easy to be very bad as an architect. It's very, very easy. It is very hard to do things really well.
We want to design modern buildings. Architects want to do things that take advantage of all the technology that we have in our midst, and we don't want to be designing buildings like we did 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
If you're looking back to Federation, you're looking back to 1910, you're looking backwards all the time, that's what you get approved. Least trouble. Put this stuff up. Now look, blind Fred knows this is just muck. And it's going to be rubbish from this point on. It's rubbish when it starts, it's rubbish from this point on. There's no future for it. Remember, that was once modern architecture. 1910 was once modern. People forget that. And if we lose the ability to produce an architecture of today, in 100 years' time, there'll be a lost 2 generations, 3 generations of what potentially could be great architecture.